Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Digital Diary. We are really glad that you joined us today. Quick introductions. I am Karen Farnsworth, part of the Gammill Education team, and joining me today are several other members of the Gammill Education team. We have Lisa Rogers, she's out of Utah, and Georgia Stoll from Missouri. We've got Paige Johnson of Minnesota, and Holly Zuber, South Dakota. So we are here to talk about today. Our topic for this digital diary is crosshatch. And I'm gonna share my screen so that we can start a discussion, because what we've done is we've gathered some questions that we've received lately or seen on the Facebook groups about crosshatching in your quilting. And so we want to just kind of talk about some of those questions. Let me grab my screen share. And we're actually looking at Creative Studio because I put the questions here into Creative Studio so that we can also show some patterns. All right, first question. Girls, what is crosshatch?
It's a mainstay. It's something that has been around since our great-grandmother's time. And it still truly has a purpose, whether it's an everyday quilt, a show quilt, anything that you want to do that is going to be simple looking.
Yeah.
And it's a calming effect, I think. Works great in a lot of applications. I do a lot of it. I like it. And I'll do it over embroidery a lot of times.
Me
or
too.
The background of applique.
Yeah, so in simple terms, crosshatch is it's a line design pattern, right?
Right.
And I love lines, and I like pairing it with other types of patterns as well. I've seen some really cool quilts, quilting techniques where like a feather design is combined with line stitching like a crosshatch, and I really like that effect. It's very pretty. All right, so question number 2. I mean, did we define crosshatch well enough here?
Well,
Yeah.
crosshatch can either be at different angles as well. You can have a 45-degree crosshatch where 90 degrees, like a square, is just set on point. And you can also have a 60-30 degree, so it's a diamond.
Okay,
And
I
that
like
crosshatches.
I like that. So I had just a couple of picture examples of actual
There we go.
designs that are in my
Ooh.
database. So this is like a double line crosshatch.
I love that.
So,
I like this a lot.
but it's more like the diamond that you were talking about instead of an actual, the 90 degree. Would you guys consider a wavy crosshatch a crosshatch?
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, me too. I think it accomplishes essentially the same effect. But sometimes it's actually even easier to use on projects where you don't want straight lines in the piecing to compete with straight lines in the pattern. But it's just a texture, nothing but a texture. Here's an example of a traditional crosshatch, right? I think this would be probably the base idea of a crosshatch. Just one row of it is what we're seeing here. And Paige, you mentioned stitching over embroidery. So one of my pictures is of a chain link. So it's sort of a crosshatch. It's not exactly a crosshatch, but it's the same kind of resulting texture. And I stitched right over the embroidery.
I do that a lot in blocks, and you really don't see the thread over the top of the embroidery, but it just lays everything down nice and simple and just lets the embroidery show off.
I'll do this a lot over counted cross stitch. And people sometimes don't want
exactly
over it. But seriously, if you don't quilt something down, it is going to get more wear and tear. And this is an excellent way to stabilize a quilt, especially with a large area that you want something in. Crosshatch is simple looking.
I actually have an example of a piece of fabric where I left a big hole around the embroidery, and I have one where I crosshatched over it. so that they can see you really don't see the thread in the one you did. And I leave it hanging up so it's saggy and they see that it's not a look they want. And because it is sometimes difficult to convince a customer that you do want to go over it.
I love that you said that, because that's what I was going to suggest. Like our viewers, if you have a hard time convincing your customers, now the customer's always right, you do what they want, but sometimes they don't know what they want because they haven't seen the comparison.
Right.
So keep it, if nothing else, keep a picture, take a screenshot right here of this so that you can show that customer when they bring in that embroidered project and they want you to stitch around the embroidery, you can say to them, but look at this effect. It really isn't going to detract from your embroidery. Are you sure you wouldn't like to consider this at an edge-to-edge charge rather than a custom charge?
Yes, and going around things like that is so much more difficult. There's more time, more effort, and you're going to see those either tie-offs or the overstitching. So going right over the embroidery is actually the best option for both you and your customer.
Right, and like you both said, Paige and Georgia, it's a stabilizing effect. It stabilizes the quilt, which is really important for the long use and the long wear of this quilt.
Right.
So it is a great, and maybe that is why our grandmothers used it so much, is because it was so valuable, and they're stitching too, just like us.
Right.
Well, and just like now, back then, of course, they wanted to highlight the piecing. So cross-hatching was a great way to just put a texture on a quilt instead of competing with the piecing of a quilt. So it got the job done. It didn't detract from the piecing. It was simple to do. So we've kind of answered our second question, right? Like, why would I consider using crosshatch on a quilt? For all of those reasons, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's a great overall, and it also will highlight certain areas. So it's one of those patterns that does it all.
So we've answered question number 3 too, because I get this question, a lot, and usually it's paired with question number 4. So can I do a crosshatch on an entire quilt? And then the question is, my customer wants me to do it at a reduced charge, right? Because it's so simple. Well, they think it's simple, but I mean, what do you gals say?
Never charge less for it, because actually its simplicity, I think, is sort of why it's a little bit more challenging to make sure the points line up. And I think for computerized, it's a little bit more. This is where shrinkage really, really, really comes into play. So it's very possible. I certainly know how, but it is not a simple thing.
There's more work involved in crosshatch than people think. It's like saying, oh, just ditch it.
Yeah.
Right? It's not as simple as they think.
A crosshatch, usually you want it smaller and denser. So if you have a 30-inch head machine, you want to get as much as you can in that one pass. So if you're going to do it tighter and denser for that crosshatch, you're going to have to do more passes, which again means more work. Even if it's edge to edge, it's still a lot more dense, which is going to take up more time. Yeah, and more shrinkage.
More shrinkage.
Yeah. So again, a 30-inch head, I could do one pass with the big edge to edge, but I'm going to have to do a lot more with that crosshatch that you want.
So you guys mentioned the shrinkage, right? And so if you're talking about computerized quilting, and putting a crosshatch on a large area of a quilt, whether it's the whole quilt or it's a central area, right? There are some techniques that you can use to make sure that that crosshatch lines up from row to row, right? And I'm pretty sure, because I've talked to everybody, but that myself and Georgia and Paige, we all have techniques that we use and that we're willing to teach and show. So if somebody's interested in understanding, like, how can I actually get be sure that my rows of crosshatch align, we all have different techniques, but educator consults are a great way to ask and get specific information about a technique like that.
The other thing is doing fills with cross hatching. There are some tricks because you get overstitching around the edges of things.
Right.
So this looks fantastic. It's simple, but sometimes there's tricks to go with it. And I agree, Karen, the educator consults are a great way to get the information that you're going to need for your specific project.
And I think the hardest part is, just speaking as computerized user, is it looks perfect on the screen. You know, you do your first pass, you do the second pass, and it's halfway through the row or a third of the way, you realize, wait a minute, this isn't going to work. And I think that makes it a little more difficult, especially for people maybe just moving into the computerized world of, wait, it looks perfect on the screen, and it's our friend shrinkage always. And so, yeah, before you take on a whole quilt of crosshatch, get some help a little bit, you know, some
this
advice.
is custom. Even doing
It is.
an overall, I consider it, I don't price it as such, but I consider it more custom because of the lining up.
Yeah, it's a more expensive edge to edge for me, that's for sure.
Yeah, there's a lot less wiggle room for adjustment on a crosshatch. It all has to line up and your eye follows those lines. So you don't have a lot of wiggle room to move things around. So it is custom, I agree.
Yeah.
So, and another real benefit to the educator consults, just getting one of us, you know, FaceTime for an hour, is that, so if you had an applique quilt like this one, not all quilts are created equal, right? So the shapes that you are working with and the patterns that you need to use for your background fills, let's say you're working on a custom quilt like this, are going to be unique to your project. And that's a time when we can take a look at your quilt, exactly what you're working with. Like the motifs here are the appliques, they're off center. There's a lot of detail in there. We can help you understand whether trim or fill would be a better way, or even ruler work. I'm not going to say, I know one of our questions was, are there other ways to accomplish crosshatch other than, you know, computerized? Yeah. You can use a ruler, you can use your channel locks, you can free motion. All of those are valid ways.
Well, if you go back to that picture, Karen, because I wanted to point something out that I really like. I would be hesitant to use a crosshatch on this background fabric, but you nailed it. Look at, you've got it fitting the fabric. And that can be done.
Very intentional.
Yep, that can be done. But again, that is just one more piece of it that is adds difficulty. There's no wiggle room.
Yeah.
Right. But it makes such a nice, it's just a texture in the background that doesn't detract from anything else. In fact, it accentuates those appliques.
Yep.
And I think once you learn how to deal with it, you learn it, and then you can use it from there. You may have to rethink because it's a different kind of a block, but now you know like what to watch for and how, and have ways to overcome it. So.
Okay, go back to your freehand or computer. How many people do ruler work?
I did that project with ruler work.
The thing is, you can use a channel lock to do a crosshatch too.
Yep.
I've done channel lock.
Yep.
That's what I do, is channel lock. And I use a ruler to
right. So there's a lot of different methods.
Yep.
And it sort of depends on whether you're doing a small area, a background area, a whole quilt. I don't do one thing for all of them. And, you know, I mean, there are some of the characteristics are similar and things that you have to keep in mind, but they're not all exactly the same.
And that's why it would be important to check your pattern itself to make sure the pattern is lined up correctly, go into nodes to see how they overlap, and, you know, go in real tight on your nodes and then expand it out to see if they are matching up really good on your computer. Because sometimes the problem could be the pattern itself, not you lining it up.
Well, and you cannot adjust a crosshatch pattern like you do others. you can't use gray handles. You can't use only the squares, not even the triangles, because that's where you're going to mess with the angle and how the patterns line up.
Right.
Right.
I'm glad you brought up the patterns though, Holly, because there are a lot of different types of crosshatch patterns. We've shown a few different like visual types, but there's also a zillion different sizes. A lot of different designers create crosshatch patterns. If you go to the Pattern Cloud store and search crosshatch, you're going to find a lot of different options. And one of the benefits we have with Creative Studio is that we can audition those patterns in our project so that we can decide if that particular pattern is going to set up with repeats, for instance, like this one does. And this one also needs alternating in order for the rows to line up. As you can see, I've got an alternating, and those kind of things we can find out before we actually purchase the pattern to make sure that they're probably going to work for our project. So
right. Try before you buy. It's always great.
Yeah, and you can always make crosshatch patterns yourself. It's a draw line.
And I bet, Paige, that you would be willing to show somebody how to do that in an educator consult as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the nice thing about drawing your own is you can custom fit it. I've had patterns where I just couldn't find a crosshatch that I liked and how it fit in there perfectly from corner to corner. And like you said, Paige, then when you make them, they do fit into those pattern, those areas corner to corner, and they fit beautifully because we have that ability in Creative Studio.
Right. And with us being able to set our grid to anything practically, that really gives us, and grid point snap, woohoo, we can make it easy peasy.
Right.
I really like the movement of that pattern, Karen.
Yeah.
That's kind of fun.
And one we didn't talk about that I love in the background is curved crosshatch. I just love it in the background. It's just so pretty, especially, depending on how a block is made, but I do love that.
I do too. And since you brought that up, I like when we already mentioned when crosshatch is just an element in a design, it's just part of that design, and it really sets off the feathers or the pearls or the floral or whatever else. So sometimes you just see little bits of crosshatch in the designs that you're choosing and that you're using. So the crosshatch itself doesn't have to line up row to row, but it is an element of the edge to edge or the block that you're using.
That contrast just makes the quilt special, I think. I love contrast. Whether they're straight or curvy like this, but it's very contrasting to feathers or florals, and it just stands out.
I was going to say, a lot of times it makes the other designs pop by keeping it simple.
Yeah.
Right, because it gives your eye a place to stop and rest. It's a resting spot from all the other exciting things that you put on a quilt. So crosshatch is a great resting spot, which brings interest.
Yes, it does. And it can be used rather effectively over very patterned fabrics because it does not distract from the fabric itself.
Right.
So that's something for people to think about. Is it's so simple, it lets the fabric speak for itself. It doesn't overpower it.
Right.
Again, it creates that resting spot, right, Paige?
Yep.
Where your eye can rest and appreciate everything else on the quilt.
Right.
Well, hopefully we've given you something to think about, some inspiration about crosshatch. Obviously, we are all very excited about it. We use it in our quilting, and we're just glad that you would join us. And hopefully you got a little bit of inspiration out of our discussion today and know where to go for more information. If you have any questions about crosshatch or you're ready to go find those crosshatch patterns to use on your next quilt. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you for the next digital diary.
Happy quilting.
Bye, everybody.